It's all from Hazel A Patterns and welcome to my latest video. This one, you can see what we're making today. We're hanging right behind us. This is the hanging storage pockets. Not a very exciting name, but I really wanted to just say what it does. This one was actually inspired by a comment my friend made ages ago when I made this little number here. This pattern is available and it's one of my older patterns, so everything is measured rather than having proper pattern pieces, because that's what I used to do. This is a nice little jewellery roll here, but you can see I've used mine for my sewing machine feet, for my old sewing machine. And when I made it, my friend said, "Oh, I want to make one that hangs on the wall." So, and I said, "Oh, the only thing is this one you wouldn't be able to, blah, 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 reasons." And so didn't think anything more of it. And then with the fabrics we had this month, I just thought, oh my goodness, that's going to look so amazing as storage pockets. So hence what we have here. So I'll show you the pattern first of all. This is it. Don't know why, but my printer has interpreted this as the brightest blue you can possibly imagine, but it's actually turquoise. So when you buy my pattern, you get a tutorial with 14 photos on it, 6 steps. The pattern encompasses 2 versions. I've called them version A and version B, but version B is actually adaptable to do different things. So you get all your pattern pieces, which you put together yourself. This is version A, and you can see it's got there's 4 different styles of pockets on there. So this version, everything is completely marked out for you to work with. We are going to make today version B. I've actually got 2 version Bs here. This is the one we're making, and I've done the version with 4 pockets. And there's a version with 3 pockets or 6 pockets. So basically, everything I show you on the video is suitable for making version A, but I'm showing you how to make version B because it's slightly more complicated in how you put everything together. Last thing, this video is a little bit longer than most of my videos, and that is because I show you how to do binding. I have a free guide which you can download from my website. The details will hopefully pop up above my shoulder once I've actually edited them in. And basically I follow that guide to show you how to bind. So once you've actually done that, you can bind anything. Okay, that's enough whittering on for now. Let's get on with it. Before we get started on the details of the pattern itself, I just wanted to have a quick chat about binding. Now, I know a lot of you lovely people who make my patterns also do patchwork and quilting, so you will have a rotary cutter and a gridded ruler, so you'll be used to the idea of cutting strips. But for those that don't, I've got a couple of different methods for you. So first of all, you can see we need 1.5 inch strips, and I've put 6, that's of a fat quarter. Obviously, if you're using something else, you can then just work it out to the inches that I've given you there. And then we need 2.25 inch strips for binding the whole thing. Let's pop this to one side. Now, I struggle to cut any long lines. I've got very poor hand strength. I've tried everything, just can't do it. So the method that I use is this. So you take your fat quarter, you've got your nice cut centre section, which you have to assume has been cut correctly. And then what I usually do is line it up so it's absolutely level with the edge of the selvage. Now, then I'm just going to do a small crease at the end. So we know that that end there and the creased line that I've just done at the bottom is parallel. These edges here may or may not line up depending on how it's been cut. So then I'm going to bring the fold up. Now I like to do it so it's not quite to the edge, so I can see and keep checking that it's still parallel, because this way you know you're going to get some decent straight lengths. So now when you're cutting, instead of having to cut a great big long 22-inch piece, you're only cutting a little short piece. So if you're going to use your gridded ruler, what I would do first then is cut one edge to make sure you're getting a really nice accurate cut. Then you might have to turn the piece around depending on whether it's at the edge of your table and you can turn around or not. But then you're going to use your ruler, obviously this way around because I'm right-handed, line it up, press down as hard as you can. Now if you've got any hand strength issues, you can put the whole weight down there, and then you're going to use your rotary cutter to cut. Now if you're someone who doesn't have any of this equipment, you're just starting, these things are quite expensive, you might then want to go to your child's section or your grandchild and steal their ruler, because this is going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to use my chalk pencil here, so you can see what you're going to do. Assume that I have straightened up this edge. You're going to then make 3 or 4 marks down the edge. Again, making sure you're not moving any of this so you know that it's parallel. You'll draw your line, get the biggest shears that you have, because the longer they are, the easier it is to cut, and then just cut the line, and you can do that for as many strips as you need. We've got one last alternative, which is for people who don't want to do what I've just suggested. You don't want to cut strips, you want to just get on with it. This is pre-made binding. It's 100% cotton, this one. I've managed to find a supplier that has different sizes so that I could have exactly the same colour. Now this binding has already been made. This is bias binding, so it has got a slight stretch to it because it's on the diagonal grain of the fabric. But you can see this is a 3/4 inch bias binding. It's already been folded and pressed, so you're ready to go. For the 2¼ inch on the outside, you can't get exactly the same as that in a pre-made, but I got this 30-inch one. So as we go along to the different sequences where we need to use binding, I will show you how to use this binding instead. When you print off your pattern, you will end up with various sheets with pattern pieces that you need to join together, and you will have a cutting chart which tells you what you need to cut of each piece. When you put them together, you're going to end up with some big pieces like this. Let me remove those. So this is version A, and you can see it's got 4 rows of pockets. Everything is marked on there for you. You have then got your pocket pieces, 4 different variants, and again everything is marked on there for you. Now that's the version I made for the main tutorial, but I'm going to make a slightly different version today. So version B, I have actually printed out for you, created individual sections that go with each style of pocket, and they're all the same apart from this version here, which is for pocket C. The gap between each of the rows of pockets and between the top and the bottom is 1 inch, but on this one, because they're slightly different size pockets, the gap between the dotted line and the top of the pockets is around 2/3 of an inch. So this pattern's created slightly differently, and that's why I'm going to show you this one when we get going. So the first thing I would do whenever you've printed off a pattern, if you've got an awl, this makes life very easy, but if you've got any of these little circle marks, I would poke the awl carefully. Obviously you do not want to put this through your fingers, and poke it through each of these little circles, because when we come to transfer the marks, it makes it really easy to just draw straight through. Now, there's a lot of marks on this pattern. That's because I've done all the calculations and work for you prior to you actually coming on to sew. You don't have to transfer all the marks at once. I tell you in the pattern exactly when to transfer each mark. So I'm going to get rid of these and the pockets. So we're going to start off with the front. There we go. I have gone ahead and I've used a spray glue to attach my batting to the front. That's because I just find it easier to hold it all together, but actually you can just use clips around the edge until you've started putting stitching lines on, or you can use quilters safety pins. So if I show you, then if you were using this main pattern piece, what you would have to do now is mark on the pocket binding placement lines. Now I've gone ahead and on my pattern I have folded it up each time there's a placement line, and then you can use a ruler to help you, or you can just draw straight along the edge of the pattern, fold it back down and do the top two, and that's done. But we are going to use this piece here. So let me first of all, I'm going to fold it up along the dotted lines. In fact, let's fold it that way round, and then I can fold it over. And do the same with the placement line. And on this pattern piece, as I said, you've got the dotted line, which matches the other dotted line, plus you've got the top of the pattern. Here we go. So you can see there I've got the 3 crease marks, and then I'm going to start out by popping this to the top of the pattern. Now I'm using an air dry marker here, an air erasable marker here. I often use friction pens, which I know some people recoil in horror from them because they can mark your fabric. But for this, because I'm using vinyl, I didn't want to use any heat. So I've ended up trying these pens on my fabric. They are air erasable or water erasable. So if you make a mistake, you can put water on it straight away. If you are patient, you can just wait for a week and it will disappear by itself. So, oops. So it might be worth, if you're a real stickler for getting it absolutely accurate, it might be worth putting a ruler down. Now, on the instructions, you can see it says you also need to mark where the dotted line is, and that's why I folded that line up here. So I'm just going to mark it at each side, because what I'm now going to do, I said with this one the dotted line is lower down than the top. I'm going to match the dotted line to the marks I've just made. I'm going to draw on the placement line. I do prefer to use a ruler. I like to think that I'm free and easy and it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, but unfortunately that's not the kind of person I am. Although the sewing police are not going to come around to your house and check. So you do it how you feel comfortable doing it. Again, fold that down. Make a little mark just at the ends. Same again. The great thing about these air erasable markers is they're basically felt tips, so they work perfectly. Well, oops, I forgot to do my other mark. So naughty. Right, that was my placement mark. I thought it didn't fit at the bottom, but it's because I hadn't done my dotted line as well. And then with any luck, when I get to the bottom, yeah, that fits almost perfectly. And I can draw on the last binding placement line without the ruler. And now I'll do it with the ruler. So that's it for the preparation. We are all ready to get sewing. Before we start sewing, we need to just press our binding, and this is really straightforward. Fold it in half with the right side out and press. Obviously minding your fingers. I'm preparing 2 strips because I've got 4 pockets. 2 of the options have got 5 pockets, so you'll need to prepare 3 strips. Now this next bit is really straightforward, and actually with this version it's quite obvious because you can see where your stitching line is going to be, so you're going to work out straight away where your binding is going to go. So take your binding piece, the raw edge needs to go to the placement line there. Now you've got 3 options really for how you secure that for sewing. You can use double-sided tape, which will keep it really nice and straight for you. So if you're a little bit unsure, use the tape. You can use pins and just pin it across. I like to do it by eye. So I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine, and then we are going to stitch these 4 rows into position. So here we are over at my machine, and you can see I've got my 1/4 inch foot on, which means it's got like a fence on one side that you can then run along the edge of your fabric, and you come out with your stitching line in the right place. Obviously if you've got a walking foot, that's also brilliant because that will mean everything will feed nicely. So this is where Oops. I like to just adjust it as I go along, just in case I start to go off my stitching line. I've turned my stitch length up to 3 because again it helps with feeding when you've got layers. So stop where you've rested your fingers, put it into position again. You know that where you've actually where you're holding it in place, you know that it's accurate up to that point, so you can always do a couple of inches at a time. And then when you get to the end, reverse. And then you can cut the binding and do the next strip. I'll just show you here where we've got to. You can see the stitching is 1/4 of an inch down. Later on we will be flipping this up to cover our pleated pockets, and that's how we make it. I will do the last 2 rows and then we'll go back over to the ironing board. So this is a little postscript to the binding. If you're using ready-made binding, just press it open and then press it in half. And then you can see, stitch it on in exactly the same way. The binding is very slightly narrower than before, but that's not going to make much difference once it's put in place. So now you're going to take the rest of your binding strips. I've got 4, but you might have 3 or 5. And we're going to use this, which is a 3/4 inch binding maker. If you don't have one of these, don't worry. You just need to draw a line down the centre of your binding and then fold it to the centre, press it, and then fold the other side to match. It's a little bit of a faff, which is why this is so handy. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to feed your fabric into the binding maker. Now if you're really lucky, it will come through first time and you won't have any problems, but if not, mine set actually came with this lovely awl, which I use for other things anyway. So I'm just going to use that to try and gently push the fabric through without bunching it up. You can see it's nearly out the other end. Yeah, there we go. So make sure it's nice and centred, and the first thing I'm going to do then is press this to start it off. So be careful with your fingers. Oops. You can put a pin in the end if you don't want to get your fingers too close to the iron. And then I'm going to pull this down and move the iron at the same time. Try and do it gently because you can end up with annoying creases. A friend of mine found a tip to use your hair straighteners. So if you have hair that is long or needs straightening, you might have hair straighteners, and give them a go. Obviously, you know that my hair's really short and I definitely don't need hair straighteners. Nearly there. So it looks like it's starting to try and kink there, so I'm going to move it back up. There we go. So that's one single fold binding strip. We want it to be double fold because we're going to use it to enclose the top of our vinyl. So this is just as straightforward as you think it's going to be. We're just going to press the whole length in half so the folded edges are together. And then we can use it to go over the top of our vinyl. There we have it. I'm going to do the other 3 pieces and then we'll move on to the vinyl. So this is the bit you're going to find really frustrating for a minute or two, because we have the clear vinyl and you see it with just one layer, you can barely see it. Now you can probably see I've actually chosen to use a glitter vinyl. Not sure if that's going to show up at all on camera. Oh, I think it is, because I found with the commercial vinyls that you can just buy on the high street, the glitter one is slightly thicker than any of the others, probably because it has to enclose the particles of glitter. So rather than buying an expensive one designed for crafts, some of which are £10 a metre, I've just gone for a standard one from an ordinary high street store, and it does the job. So what we're going to do to make our lives a lot easier is we are actually going to put tape at the top. Now this has 2 purposes. One, it means we can see what we're doing, hooray! And 2, in fact, no, let's start again. It has 3 purposes. 1, it means we can see what we're doing. 2, it means we can use an ordinary sewing machine foot rather than requiring a walking foot. And 3, when it comes to making our marks, you can mark onto this, stitch through it, and then tear it off afterwards. So straight away you can actually see what we're going to do. If you're using washi tape, try and use one with a white background, otherwise you're not going to be able to see through it to draw the pattern lines on. If you haven't got washi tape, then ordinary painter's tape or masking tape will do the job just as well. Just I have lots of lovely washi tape that Vicky has given to me, and I've got a wonderful Dungeons and Dragons one to use for the final section, but that has got a dark background, so I can't use it for this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the others, and then we'll go over to the sewing machine and we will stitch on our binding. So first thing I'm going to do is change out my foot. So I'm no longer using the 1/4 inch foot, but I'm actually going to use my open-toed foot, but you can use whichever foot you are most comfortable with when you're doing edge stitching. Now, to do this, you could easily run a line of double-sided tape down the inside, a very narrow line, or you can clip it all the way down. As you know, I'm a big believer in the fact that I have the ability to shift any of these clips into the wrong position. So I am going to just stitch it using my eye. So on this foot, there's like a little triangle here. And I know that if I put the edge of the triangle, the left-hand edge of the triangle, against the edge of what I'm sewing, the edge stitching will always appear in the correct place. So I'm actually going to start out just to get it going. Luckily that bit's going to be hidden, so it doesn't matter if it isn't perfect. And then, as I usually do, I'm going to use my fingers to pull it to exactly where I want it to be, and I'm pulling it tightly against the edge of the plastic at the top. So I'm going to do again a little bit more, pull it with my fingers so the crease is in the right place, and I know that wherever I'm holding it with my fingers, I know it's actually okay. So keep going down, keep making sure that the fold is against the top of the plastic. You see, you're seeing a lot of my fingers. Just try and move the camera up a bit so you can see a bit better. Especially when you get to the end, just keep checking that it's still in position. And when you get to the end, just do a tiny little back stitch. We try not to do too much back stitching or anything on plastic because it will perforate it. And there we have it. One row of stitching, and it's stitched through on the back as well. So I'm going to carry on and do the other 3, and then we will move on to the next step. So the last thing we're going to do with this is we are going to trim the binding off to fit. Obviously, if you were using ready-made binding, you would fold it in half in exactly the same way and press it. So it's very tiny bit narrower than ours, but it will still do exactly the same job. That's it. So now we are going to transfer all the markings and get ready to sew our pockets to our front. So I think I forgot to press record there, so let's do a little recap. What we're going to do now is I've trimmed off all the little whiskers on here. I will trim off the others before I go to the sewing machine, and we are going to transfer the marks from the pattern piece onto our front and binding pieces. So line up your stitching line. And you can see I've done this top one already. And then you're literally going to put your pen through everywhere there's a little circle. And when that's done, you're going to end up with a row of dots on the binding, and then a row of dots on the fabric at the front, which is why we're using air erasable pens, so I don't have to use the iron to get rid of those. Let's just do the last 2. And you can use pattern weights if you want to. There we go. That is now all marked up and ready to go. So I will trim off these little sections, and then we'll get our pocket pieces ready to mark those up. So obviously we don't want to draw any lines on our vinyl because we won't get them out, or they'll come off all over our fingers. So we're going to add washi tape like we did across the top, which has the added benefit of us being able to stitch without having to use a walking foot. So I'm just going to put it roughly over the areas that the lines are, the vertical lines for stitching. And then once it's on, I'm going to line it all back up perfectly so we can trace the lines. Okay. There we go. So this is where hopefully you have got a pale enough washi tape that you can actually see. Otherwise you're just going to have to find the top and the bottom and use a ruler to draw the line. There we go. And the next thing we need to do is we need to take a permanent marker, because we are going to mark directly onto the vinyl. So I'm using a Sharpie and we're going to mark where the little triangle is. We just need to do a little dash and do it as short as possible so that it's not going to be seen once you stitch the binding over it. There we go. So that's what we're going to end up with. I'm going to do the others and then we'll go over to the sewing machine. So what I should have done over there and forgot, but I'm going to do here for you, is I'm going to show you on the pattern pieces. You can see that each of the lines has a number above it. And so essentially what we're going to do is be stitching the corresponding number to create a series of loops. So it's easiest if you start at the bottom. So I've got my front here. I have to apologise, the sun has just come out so brightly. It hasn't done that for such a long time. But it's lovely to see. But it's really messed up the lighting to a certain extent. So on here I've got the line which I've lined up at the bottom, and then I'm just eyeballing it at the top, and I can see that is where I'm going to have to stitch. Now just because this is the first piece, I'm going to put a couple of clips in to hold it just while I swing it round to get it underneath the sewing machine. So I've lined up the pocket literally just above the stitching line there, so that when it's all done we can fold this up and cover up our pleats. So starting from the bottom, make sure you don't stitch over the original stitching line. And again, you can see easily if you're going to be stitching up towards the dot. And because we've got such a big stitch width, I'm going to do a little bit of back stitching at the very beginning, and other than that I'm just going to stitch up that line. I'm going to flip that back out of the way just so that I don't accidentally sew over it, and then I'm going to back stitch back down. take my clips out because this one is now done, and pull this back, and you can see we're going to ignore the second dot because that is eventually going to match up with our permanent marker, and we're going to put the dot after that matching, and you can see the dot under there matches. So line it up against so that you can stitch right down the stitching line. Reverse back and then stitch away. I haven't flipped back the binding this time because I wanted to see if I could stop in time, and I could. So same again, match that, match the dot, hold it carefully, last one. I think the hardest bit is not getting it out of position when you swing it across, which I have just done there. This is where clips are handy on the edge. That's it. Perfect. So you can see you've ended up with a series of loops. There's 3 on this set of pockets, 4 or 6 altogether. And I'm going to go on, complete the other rows, and then we'll go back over to the cutting desk. So because we know that getting a really nice finish is all in the prep and all the things we do before we finish stitching, we are going to snip off any little threads, any that are really visible on the inside, try and pull them out, or at least pull them down so that they're not going to show in the final thing. And we're also going to take off our tape. Now this is where your awl comes in really handy if you've got one, because you can get it started with the awl and then pull it down. Now if you end up with any little pieces like this, again you can use the awl to weed them out. There we go, that's one row done. I will complete the rest and then we're on to the next step. So we're on to the final stage of creating the pockets, and I've turned everything upside down because then I'm working with the edges that have not been bound. So I'm going to start at one side, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to match up that little red mark there made with a permanent marker with the dot the centre dot from in there. Then I'm going to use my fingers to tuck the pleat under and try and move it around with my fingers until I'm comfortable that it's touching the pleat is touching the stitching line there. Then I'm going to put a clip in top and bottom, and then we're going to do the other side. I mean, you can press this vinyl easily with your fingers because it always springs back up into shape anyway. So next one, so red mark in the centre, or whichever colour you chose to use. Clips top and bottom. Any more little bits of thread just suddenly appear, then get rid. And last one. There we go. So press that down with the fingers, and you can see we're going to need to take out this row of clips before we can pleat up the next one. So this is the point which I'm going to push all these clips so they're all the way up, which means you know that where the top of the clip is approximately 1/2 inch, because these are binding clips. And I want this to run along this tape at about 1/2 inch. You see this lovely Dungeons and Dragons tape, which my friend Claire gave to me. So I'm going to run that along. There we go. And then clips out. And what we're going to do is go over to the sewing machine and flip this up and edge stitch it, and our pocket will be held in place. So I'm going to do each one at a time because I find it easier that way, and then you can get rid of all the clips and things, because obviously you've got the bulk of the pockets here which will be running up against your sewing machine foot there. So I'm going to go and edge stitch that. I'm not going to show you it because it's fairly obvious what I'm going to do, and then we'll do the next row. And there we go. Let me lift this up to the camera so you can see. So I've flipped it up. Again, if you're worried, you can use a line of double-sided tape underneath just to hold it in position. But otherwise, the main thing is make sure you're not pulling it up too tight because it will lift this fabric underneath. So just pull it up gently to cover your pocket, and then you're ready to pleat the next one. And then the brilliant thing about washi tape is it is reusable quite a few times before it loses its stickiness. So that's what I'm going to do. Take the clips out, go over and stitch, and repeat it 2 more times, and then we're ready for our hanging loops. So here we have the finished thing. So let me bring this up to the camera so you can see. So all of the binding strips are stitched into place, which is now holding the pleats in place. You can see where we spent time getting rid of all the little bits of fabric inside. There are no little whiskers showing. And we are ready to complete it. So we're going to put our back on, our hanging loops, and then I'm going to show you how to do the binding. We're going to now make our hanging loops. I'm slightly cheating here because I didn't cut out my hanging loop pieces. I wasn't sure how much was going to be left over once I'd put the binding on the top of the vinyl. And I actually did have enough left over that I can actually just reuse the pieces we had. But if not, you would have folded it in half, ironed it, opened it out, pressed the sides into the centre, and then pressed it again. I'll just give this one a quick press. So that's ready to take over and edge stitch. And in true television traditions, here's one I created earlier. Now, I wanted to just mention this to anybody that hasn't tried this before. If you've got a really tiny piece of fabric or something that you're trying to machine stitch, sometimes it gets caught down into the sewing machine. Don't know why it happens, it just does. So what I've done, this is a tip I got from various quilting people, is you use a piece of scrap fabric first as a sort of leader, and then when you start feeding on your piece, it always stitches perfectly. So that's a little tip. So I'm going to nip that off, and we will turn this into a perfect hanging loop. So we're going to start out by folding it in half and giving it a press. You could finger press this, but since I've got the iron right here. And so you have the stitch line at the bottom, you can see your centre crease, and what you need to do is fold almost like a little triangle point there. I'm going to pop a clip in just to hold it for 1 minute while I do the other side, and then going to fold the other side down in exactly the same way. I'm just going to put that clip in to hold it together and put that one on to hold it there. So I will go and get the next one ready, and then we will mark up the back and I'll show you where we're going to stitch it. So here's my piece that I've prepared before, and I have attached my back in exactly the same way as the front. So if you're using clips, you can clip it round. Otherwise, I've used a bit of spray glue so it's not going anywhere. So the next thing we're going to need to do is transfer the marks for the top. Now, I could have done that before putting the back on, but because it involved going outside and spraying some very smelly glue, I didn't want to do that. So on the pattern piece, there's marks for the placement, and the best thing to do is actually just cut down and then fold them back, and then you've got a really nice space for marking. I'm using my air erasable pen again. And then we want to make sure that the pointy nice pretty side of the hook is at the front when we go to finish it off. And so what I'm going to do is literally pop it with that side facing upwards between the two marks. I'm going to temporarily clip it in place. Then I'm going to take it over to the machine and stitch it in place at about 1/8 of an inch down from the top. Let's clip that one in. There's one last thing that's important to consider at this stage. The next thing we're going to do after this is put our binding on, and we want to make sure that that all the layers are completely even. So I don't know if you can see here, that is poking out a bit. So I'm actually going to trim that down so that when I go to do the binding, it makes it nice and easy and I can see exactly where I'm going to stitch. So let's pop these up so you can see. There we go. I will go and stitch those and then we will start on the binding. For this piece that we're working on, I have suggested you cut 2 1/4 inch strips for your binding, which gives you a sort of approximately 1/2 inch binding on the front. So first thing I always do with my strips is I check that I've got them all facing the correct way up. It's really easy when you're joining loads of strips of binding to actually have them the wrong way up, and you then don't notice until you're stitching all on. So I'm just using an ordinary pencil to mark this, and I'm going to stitch all of mine at this end. So I'm going to start by turning over one of the strips, and at the moment I'm not putting it right at the very end. I'm marking where it overlaps with that strip there, and then I'm going to draw a diagonal line just with a pencil because it's going inside. And then I am going to rest the end, match it so it's properly together. I'll put a couple of clips in so I don't accidentally pull it out. And then we're going to do the same at this end. So one strip facing up, the next one facing down. Work out the bottom of the piece so you can see where you're drawing your line to. There are other methods of doing it. I think Vicky from So Fabulous Fabrics has got a different method, but this is the one I've generally always used. Then again, pop it to the end. I'm going to put a couple of clips in just to hold it so I can take it over to the machine. I'm not going to show you me stitching down a straight line because that's not very exciting for you. But what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to stitch down these lines. I like to chain piece mine, so I'll stitch that one, then I'll immediately start stitching this one, and then I'll bring that back and I'll show you what we have to do next. So here we are, I have stitched everything, so you can see I used my little leader there, which I shall cut off, cut the pieces apart. And we have got our joins. Now we need to cut some of this off, so we're going to have a nice hem inside. You can do it with a rotary cutter. I'm just going to use my scissors. So the bigger the scissors you have, the straighter the cutting normally. And I like to press the joins open so you don't get any funny lumps or bumps. So I always like to press it first to set the stitches. I'm going to open it out and press it open, and then flip it over, holding it so that I know that's open inside. This is only a small project, so there's only the two to have to deal with. Joins, that is. Some of the bigger projects you can have so many joins. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to press it in half. The difference between quilt binding and doing a bias binding is actually you have more layers by the time you get to the top of the quilt, because it's actually folded in half first rather than a single layer at the top edge, if that makes any sense. Before I carry on pressing this, I'm just going to show you with our binding that I bought, what we're going to do is press it open, fold it in half and press it in half, and you can see it's almost identical in size to the others. So if you're using ready-made binding, use that instead of making your own. I will press the rest of these and then we'll go and get the back and I'll show you what we're doing next. So here's our back. I've actually marked on it a couple of little marks of where I want to start and stop, because I am the world's worst at getting carried away and stitching too far. So I'm going to leave approximately 6-inch tail. If you were doing a diagonal join, you would probably need more, because you really need to pull everything out to be able to cut the diagonal line, but I'm not going to do a diagonal join on this one because it is too narrow for me to want to do that. So I'm literally going to place the binding raw edge to raw edge. We're going to stitch it round and then we'll flip it round to the front. Now, some people like to clip up their binding in position before they go to stitch the machine. As you know, I prefer to do things as I go along. So we will go over to the machine and we will stitch round this piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is swap out for my 1/4-inch foot. Obviously, if you have a walking foot, this will make your life a lot easier, but I'm going to show you it without the walking foot. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn my stitching back up to about 2.8. I find that it stops the layers from creeping so much, and obviously where I've glued it as well with the spray glue, that helps as well. So we know we're starting off about 2 inches in, which is there. So the important thing is you see how we go around the corners each time. I'm just going to start this off . And then when we get closer, I might even move the camera so you can actually see there's some lines on the foot which make this really easy. If you didn't have a 1/4-inch foot and we're having to do it from scratch, you might want to mark on the binding at each corner so that you know when to stop stitching. So I don't know if you can see there, let's pull you in closer. On the foot itself, there is a line which actually shows when the needle is 1/4 inch away from the edge of what you're doing. I've actually slightly over jumped there, but there we go. If you stop there with that lined up with whatever you're working on, you know you're going to be in the correct position. So let's go back again. Now you've got two options here. Some people like to turn everything at 45 degrees and stitch off the corner. I've found it's just as easy for me to stitch back. So I've back stitched. Now this is where the magic happens, because we're going to mitre this corner so that we can actually do a proper mitre on the front. So what you first do is you pull the binding up to what looks like a 45 degree. It should be a 45 degree. You'll find out when you do this next step whether it's in the correct position or not. And then what you do is where the binding is at the top corner there, you fold it level with the top of the piece of work that you're doing. Now if you've got your 45 degree right, that actually should line up nicely there, which this one does. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a clip just to hold the very edge so that I can still get my foot round. Make sure that that's sitting nicely on this side, which it is, and I would start a little way in and reverse back. And then we're going to stitch all the way down to the next corner, and we're going to do the same thing again. So we're nearly at the corner again. I'm just going to stitch forward a couple of stitches, and that looks like it's lined up, so I'm going to reverse back, cut my thread, and let's do the whole thing again. So up for what we hope is 45 degree. You'll know if it's not, because something like that will happen, so you'll actually be able to see the edge. Let's try that. No, that's not either. That's it. Got it. Perfect. Again, one clip just on the corner to stop it from walking around. Reverse back to the edge, and here we go again. There we go. So all of our corners are mitered. We've got a nice length to work with when we go to do our join. So I'll take you back over to the cutting table and we'll get prepared for that join. Here we are. So I'm going to do my join. I like my join to be pretty accurately in the centre. So this was 10.5 wide, so it should be at 5 1/4. So I'm just going to do a little mark there. It doesn't really matter because nobody's going to see it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my two ends of binding, I'm giving them a very slight tug. Now this is Art Gallery, this fabric, which is really stable and wonderful fabric. So it doesn't stretch much, but some of the others you can find do. And I'm actually going to, where I've drawn the line, I'm actually going to fold it just to one side of that line. I'm going to press it really hard because we want a nice crease in there. Then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Give it a little tug to make sure it's pulled as tight as possible. You don't want to make this too tight, but at the same time, if you make it too loose, you end up with a little tuck, which is really annoying. So you see there's a probably less than 1/8 of an inch gap between the two, but I pressed it just so that I can see where the crease is. There we go. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cut it without opening it out. You could use your rotary cutter and get the mat, but obviously since I haven't got the mat on here, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to draw a line at 1/4 inch, and I'm going to cut it using my scissors. And do the same on the other side of the binding piece. And then what we're going to do, this is why we leave such a big gap here, we need to pull this almost closed, and I'm going to put a clip in just to hold it in position so I'm not wrestling with it, which then gives us our free ends, which we are going to open out to join. So what I'm going to do is take that over to the machine. I'm going to stitch at 1/4 inch, so pretty much where the fold line is. So I'll bring that back in a second, and then we'll press the seam open and get it in position for stitching. So here we go, I've stitched that. We can flip this back open, and actually, although I have still got my iron on, I'm going to finger press this. It's just as easy. Then I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to stitch between these two pieces here, and then the back of the stitching is finished. This is where we are going to use a lot of clips, but before we start any of that, I'm going to do what I did before and snip off any little ends, because they are so much easier to deal with now rather than once you've stitched them in place, because you can guarantee you tug the tiniest little end and you'll end up with a huge long piece that is still stuck. Okay. So I'm going to take out these 4 little clips I put on earlier, and we are going to flip this to the front. Now you can press, I'm just going to finger press. And you can see it sort of opens out nicely at the top. Straight away I found a piece that's got stitched in, but I managed to rescue it. Here we go. So flip it to the front. I always start in the centre of a seam, and you're going to pull it over. And these clips are brilliant because if you push them all the way in, you know you're at 1/2 inch. So if you make sure when you clip everything that the same amount of binding is showing at the edge of each clip, you can guarantee your binding is going to be even all the way around. I mean, otherwise you can use a ruler. So I'm going to leave the corners till last. There we go. So that's the majority of it is clipped in position. And then what I'm going to do, I actually like to do my corners whilst I'm stitching, because particularly without using a walking foot, you can find that this actually does creep slightly, so it would then make my corners off. But what you're essentially going to do is stretch this length down, miter it at the bottom to make a diagonal, and then flip this piece up so that the top edge is just slightly covering over the bottom edge. Now I'm going to pop a clip in there. You can do this by hand if you're really worried about getting it right. You can put pins in just to hold it neatly in position. Or you can do what I'm going to do, which is I'm going to use an awl to help me to get that nicely in position. Let's go over to the sewing machine. So we are going to change our machine foot out again. I'm going to start just about in the centre at the bottom, because that's nobody's really going to notice, and it will be hidden slightly, the join, by the join we did earlier. So I'm going to start off, I'm edge stitching again, so my machine stitch length is now set at 3, which is what I used for all the rest of the edge stitching. I can see I'm going to have to do something about that, because it's going to poke out and annoy me. And I'm going to use this as much as possible to try and feed everything and squish down the layers. So if you're using a walking foot, you won't necessarily have this issue anyway. And then we need to take the clips out as we go along. Obviously you have got the option of doing this on the back. I just like doing it at the front because I do like top stitching, which you may or may not have noticed from my patterns. So I'm actually going to take this clip out, and I'm going to use this tool to poke that so it's really nicely tight down there. And then to flip it forwards, lift up my foot. You can see I've got that exactly where I want it to be, and now I'm going to hold the oil all down to actually stop that from creeping or moving. I'm also going to go very slowly because it might shift suddenly. So I've literally just hit the join, hit the mitre. So I'm going to turn round. Again, make sure with my awl that everything is in the correct position. And let's go up the next edge. I'm going to do the same thing again, pull that down as tight as possible with my awl, tuck it under and bring that back up. And again, I'm going to use the awl to hold it in position swing it round. And before we get to these, I'm going to make sure I'm pulling these up and out of the way so they don't get caught up in the stitching. And there we have the binding. Just nip that off. So you can see mitered corners. Everything else is edge stitched. And there's one last thing for us to do, which is to stitch the hanging loops upwards so that they sit nicely. You could do this by hand. I'm going to do this by machine just to save time. So I'm going to start in the centre of where the loop is, and we're planning to edge stitch, so I'm using the parts of my feet as a guide. So I'm just literally going to stitch forwards till I've hit the edge of that, reverse all the way back, and stitch forward to the middle again. I'm going to do the same on the other side. I've got one thread to snip off on each side. And we are completely done. Congratulations, you have finished! It wasn't too bad, was it? And basically all of the marking out is done on the pattern, so all you have to do is sit on the sewing machine and stitch it. So I'm just going to bring this forward so you can see my cameraman. Oh, he's giving me a thumbs up, so that is fine. You can see there you've got your loops for hanging, you've got your beautiful binding, which you can now do on anything, and you've got all your pockets. I'm just going to show you quickly, I forgot to print this out earlier. This is the quilt style binding guide, which you can get free from my website. If you use that alongside this, you will be absolutely fine and you'll be confidently stitching binding on every project. In fact, I think I'm going to put binding on my next project as well. Okay, thanks for joining me. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments, or you can email me. There's a contact me form on my website. Other than that, happy sewing!